Alright, so yeah, this is going to be narrative design, and I'm Dave Town, so let's jump into it. So the first thing that I want to talk about is what is the point? Why am I standing here talking to you all about this? For the past several years I've been working to learn about narrative design because this is what I want to do. I want to make games that have good stories. And nobody really told me how to do it. So I hope I can give you guys a couple of takeaways so that you guys can tell some stories of the games you make. The first thing being, what is narrative design? And how does it work in the context of making games? How does that all work together, and how important is it when you do choose to make games? Next being, I want to give some examples of good narrative design, games that I've played that have left an impact on me based on the story that they had. And I'd love to hear some examples from all of you. So when we get to that point, make sure you think of something that can be interesting to share. I'd love to hear what you guys think for games that have impacted your lives. And I want to talk about how to do narrative design, specifically how to execute it. Everybody in here is probably going to make a game at some point while they're here, so I want to teach you guys or show you guys a way to do that. Additionally, there will be some helpful resources in the act of doing the narrative design, so those will just be scattered around in this talk, and feel free to take note of them if you want to. And please ask questions. If you have any questions on what I'm talking about, or if anything is confusing, just ask questions. I'd love to answer them, or I can answer them afterwards if you prefer. So, diving in, I am a senior here at MSU in the Game Miner program, and these are several of the games that I have played that their stories have left an impact on me. And there will be minor spoilers for some of these, because you can't really talk about the story without talking about elements of the story that do spoil things. But moving on into narrative design, what is game writing? Game writing is a kind of overarching term, and it usually gets confused with narrative design or replacing narrative design. Game writing describes any kind of writing that is done in a video game. It doesn't matter what it is. If you're writing and you're working on developing a video game, you are doing game writing. And that includes things like dialogue, for scripts, for characters, what voice actors will read when they're recording. But that also includes things like pitch presentations. If you have a game idea and you want to take that to your boss to have it made and you write up the presentation, you're doing game writing. It also does include narrative design. It does fit under this umbrella, but narrative design is not the same as game writing and should never replace game writing. And there are many more examples. Like I said, any kind of writing in the form of making a game is considered a part of game writing. And if you're more interested in the topic of game writing and its many subsets, there is an MI 491 class over the summer that is immensely helpful, and it helped me learn a lot of what I'm talking about here today. So when you go to look at your classes, just look for MI 491 over the summer and the one that is titled for game writing. So now what you're all here to learn about, what is narrative design? Well, there's a very simple and a very complicated answer to that, and it's the story. It is the story that happens in the game and the cause and effect of all of the actions that the player will take. More than anything else, it's the context. It is the why things are happening and the why players are doing anything in your game. It helps provide meaning to the game through the actions of the player and guides the player through the different mechanics of the game. In some games, the mechanics change or evolve as you go on, and it helps the player move through those. Now, anybody who's taken the game design classes here is probably very familiar with this diagram. For anybody who's not, this is a diagram of a game. The central dot, the core mechanic, or the primary gameplay loop, is the foundation of your game. It is the thing that the player will be doing every moment they play your game. It is very important to do this very well. Outside of that are the secondary mechanics, or the secondary gameplay loop. So if the primary is every moment or every second, the secondary gameplay loop is every minute. It's the second thing that the player can do in the game. Now, some games have tertiary gameplay loops or 4 gameplay loops, but 2 is pretty standard, and that's why it's on this diagram. Outside of that is the progression. In games and in stories and in storytelling, the main character is not at the same place at the end of the story when they were at the beginning, and the progression outlines that. That can be going through different levels in a game, or gaining experience and leveling up, or skill trees, but it's a way to show the player that they are growing throughout the game. And outside of that is the narrative, or the hero myth as this diagram calls it, but it's the story. And as you can see, while the primary gameplay loop is the foundation, and it is incredibly important to do that well, The narrative surrounds everything. It encompasses the entire game and touches every aspect of it. Changing the story and changing the way the game plays can have effects on all parts of the game, including mechanical and other aspects that it seems like it wouldn't. So a similar example of the diagram, these ones filled in. If you look at them, they may resemble popular games that you've played. And you can see how in all cases, the story, no matter how simple, surrounds everything and helps guide the development of all of it. Because the narrative surrounds everything, it can also address the overarching concepts of the game. Things like the impact, what you want to leave the players feeling when they put down the controller, what you want them to think about. It can guide the mechanics. Different story can demand different things from the player, so you have to design the play style to match that. So it can change how the mechanics work in the game. It can also justify changes in the mechanics. For instance, if there's a part of the game where the player needs to feel weak, it makes sense that they lose their power if the story makes sense. If it doesn't, the player can disassociate with the game. And it can go as far as taking something like a first-person shooter and in the middle of it turning it into a baking simulator. If the story's good enough, the player will understand why the change happens. And finally, it can help with the progression. Different forms of progression in games can cause different effects, and using the proper story or a good story to outline that helps the player understand why they're actually growing stronger. So if what I'm saying about context is a little weird and how that relates to the game, I'm going to play a little game with you guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and describe a game purely the mechanical, just what the player can do. And I want you guys to try and guess what game I'm talking about. Everybody understand?
Can we just shout out the answer?
Sure. Cool. So, first game is a kind of puzzle game. We have a marble and a track, and the goal is to get the marble to the end of the maze, or the track. However, you don't control the marble, you control the stage, while the camera still follows the
Super
marble.
Monkey Ball.
Yep. Super Monkey Ball. The next one is a third-person hack and slash game where you fight monsters, and you take the parts from those monsters to make yourself stronger. No.
Diablo?
No. Any other guesses? What was it?
Breath of the Wild?
No. It is The Witcher. Witcher 3 specifically because that's the one I played, but any of the Witchers make sense. Finally, we have a first-person shooter where you can jump on a roller coaster to get around, and you have minor superpowers to help fight your enemies.
Sunset Overdrive?
No, but that's a good guess. BioShock Infinite.
I've played all of these, so I don't know that thing.
Yeah, no, if you played the games, that's perfectly fine. But you can see how the story provides reason behind what you're doing, and it can help differentiate the different kinds of games. For instance, if I had just said the game was a first-person shooter, we would have been here all day trying to guess at what I was saying. There's hundreds of first-person shooters. And while they do have small mechanical differences, the story, the context, the narrative, and its design is what sets them apart and what makes them recognizable. It's what makes it recognizable when there are dozens of the same Modern Warfare games, and you can tell which one's your favorite besides just the title. So now we're going to talk about a little bit of what's required if you want to do this, if this is what you want to do professionally. This is a quote from a site where Ubisoft posted a listing for a narrative design team member. Sadly, that listing is closed, but it still describes the job that they want. Additionally, there were responsibilities outlined. Things like working with a team to develop the backstories of everything from the setting to the characters, playable and non-playable, developing that context within the world and narrative that you've created. Another part of it was communication. You have to take that idea and communicate it to an entire team, to programmers, to designers, and to artists, to make sure that everybody understands the direction that the story is going to take. As I mentioned, the story covers everything, and it touches every single part, so everybody has to be on the same page. The third part is working with gameplay designers to design more than just story elements, to design key gameplay elements outside of the story, while still holding true to the rules and the logic of the world that you're making. And finally, it's developing documentation that everybody can read so everybody can stay up to date while you're not in the same room. Now, a lot of this sounds like writing skills, and that's what a lot of people assume with narrative design. But communication is just as important. Being able to communicate this idea to dozens of different people that may not understand the same intricacies of the narrative is incredibly important. And with that, being able to talk a little bit of programming, a little bit of design, and a little bit of art, so that way when you present the ideas and the directions that the narrative can go, you're not just dropping the idea in their lap. You can give them the idea and provide a little bit of direction as to where to go, even if whatever you give as an example is not the be-all, end-all of the programming, the art, design, etc. But the important part is communication and learning to be able to describe and develop these ideas with everybody. Now we're going to talk about how to do it. If you guys have a game and you want to integrate a story into your game, how to do it. The very easy answer is documentation, above all else. Developing documents that can be read by you and everybody on your team, or even people in a team of narrative designers, as game design is done in a team most often. Being able to develop this documentation so that people can understand what's going on. This documentation will end up covering all aspects of the game, narrative and otherwise. Things like the mechanics, things like the setting, or multiple settings, and even the characters, playable and non-playable. Now, if you start this documentation at an early point in the game development cycle, you don't have to touch on every single character, setting, or mechanic used in the game. You can create overarching ideas by, say, starting at the beginning, and then the middle, and then the end, to give yourself an arc for how the story is going to go. Starting this later in the process means you have to start building on characters that it's already assumed are going to be there, quest givers, or characters that deliver the story. But if you do this early, you don't need all the characters or all the places, and they will develop organically as the game goes on. And the biggest thing is to find what works for you. The process of developing it, or even the tools used. A lot of the times in game design, or whenever you're getting into a new art form or form of creation, you ask, what is the thing? What tools do I need to do this? And the best answer I can give is to find the best that works for you and your team. This is an example of a document that I made for a game that doesn't exist. It was an idea that I had. I just used Microsoft Word, typed out in paragraphs, and for me that was the best way to communicate my ideas and to get it on paper. Another tool that comes highly recommended is Lucidchart. You may have seen these videos all over the place. It looks like the audio's not there. No, it's okay. Lucidchart is a tool for making flowcharts. The videos more just because the videos are hilarious. But this way of making flowcharts is another way to communicate, especially in narrative terms, cause and effect, and what the root of everything is. And it's used in design for games, for engineering. It's a very helpful tool overall, comes highly recommended. And what I mean by find what works for you is, this is an example from the Grim Fandango. This is part of the design document they used when making the game. Very well-built, story-developed game. And as you can see, there's a flowchart that describes all the puzzles you can encounter in a certain part of the game. This is part of the same document. And this is a script written for the cutscenes to give you an idea of what's being discussed and how much the player will know. And again, part of the same document is a much more design and descriptive written piece about specific puzzles, the solutions, and how the character might get from point A to point B in solving the puzzles. So while writing skills are important, it's not just the creative writing or the script writing that helps. Sometimes you need to just be able to write in a way that multiple people can understand and develop documents that can be seen by everybody on the team to further production. So as I mentioned before, narrative design is sometimes done in a team, as most of game design is. So who do you think is the most important designer when it comes to narrative design? Shout it out if you think you know.
Character.
Character? What do you mean?
Character designer, like the person who writes an interesting main character of that, so that we care about Nathan Drake or Geralt of Rivia.
That's a really good answer. That's not what I'm looking for.
Cool.
Who else thinks they know what's up?
Trick question.
Is this a trick question?
No, there is one. I promise there is one. Lead designer is a very good guess, but again, no. It's the player. Everything you make as a narrative designer is for the experience of the player, and it's not just their movement, but you design for the emotional response. You design for what they feel. While having a great character designer to make Nathan Drake is fantastic, nobody tells you how to make Nathan Drake feel when he discovers the body of his ancestor. He has to go through this sense of defeat. You can make the character portray that feeling, but you have to make the player feel what he's going through. One of the best examples I can give, or one of the best examples I know, is from Twilight Princess. It's the middle part of the game where you get turned into your wolf form, so you have none of the tools that Link normally has. Your companion Midna is laying on your back, and she appears to be dying. The scene is raining. There's a terrible, heart-wrenching melody that plays only at that part of the game, and you are told to go find somebody to save her, but every person you see runs and hides. They think you are a monster. All of these elements culminate to create a scene that is incredibly sad and heartfelt. But because the game changes the scope from saving the world to finding one person, it feels accomplishable more than anything else and drives you to complete it. These emotional beats are seeded throughout a lot of different games. I'm curious for who wants to share moments in games that they have played that you get that strong emotional reaction. It doesn't have to be sad. It can be happy. It can be victorious, if anyway. Does anybody have anything they want to share? Okay.
I would say in Celeste, where you as a player finally reunite with your other self, you finally come together. That part stuck with me.
That's a good example. Yeah.
One shot where you realize that the world you're in actually can't be saved.
There you go. That's another good example. The way... Oh, you want? Yeah, go for it.
Oh, the end of Nier Automata is pretty wild.
Yeah. And when you find out everything that's going on and everything.
And like just the credit sequence and like the weird sort of stuff that goes on. Without spoiling it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, there's a term that I like to use, and I just call it wiggle room. But in these moments of heavy emotional response, it seems that the game changes. Like, it's no longer the game that you play for most of it, whether it's the end of the game, the credits, or a cutscene, or a shift in mechanics. Something is different to help drive home that emotional response, that bit of wiggle room that allows the player to chew on whatever's happening and really dig into those feelings. One of my favorite examples from that is from Splinter Cell Conviction. This is a game that is a stealth-based kind of assassination game where you use little gadgets and distractions to lure enemies into the shadows and clear whole rooms without ever being noticed. And one of the tools you have to do that is this mark and execute feature. Basically, the more stealth kills you get, the faster it charges up, and then you can just pick everybody in a room, push a button, and the room is clear. Just like that. There's a moment in this game the main character finds out this secret, trying not to give too many spoilers, and it enrages him. Now you're in a building, Sam Fisher's in a building that's about to explode and he's got to leave, so he turns to leave, and enemies start flying through the windows and crash through the ceiling, and it's no longer a stealth game. That mark and execute feature is full and never runs out, so all you do is march out of that building, and then it explodes behind you in a cutscene delivered by a very gruff and interesting voice talking about whatever's happening next. This moment, this game changes from a stressful, stealth-based game to almost an action movie that you get to play through to help show his anger and to help you feel the rage that this person is going through. So anybody else, moments like that, moments where the game changes in a little bit of ways. Yeah.
This is, I don't know if this counts, but this is a pretty unique thing you just talked about reminded me of it, but if anyone's played Bastion,
Just gonna say.
towards the end of that, there's like a part where you're kind of storming a base looking for someone and you find them like almost dead and you have to pick them up and carry them, but they're still enemies and they're shooting at you, but you can't defend yourself, and you just keep going, and then as you go, they realize you're trying to save someone and they sort of stop, and then one guy still fires at you and one of the enemies shoots that other one. So it's like sort of the change to the more story-driven section when it feels like a big gameplay thing.
There you go. That's a fantastic example. Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, everybody, for contributing to this part. It's important to know that there's no real trick to making the best story for your game. So while these experiences are fantastic in certain games, they're going to be different for different games, especially games that you work on. And I mean games that all of you work on. It might sound like that narrative design is only for giant games with huge budgets and teams of people working on it with years and years and years to develop, but I absolutely disagree. And it should be included in some level in all games, especially games with shorter development cycles, especially games you'll work on. Game jam games, if you choose to participate in pre-spec. If any of you go into the minor, your development cycles will be several weeks to only a month or two, and in some of the last classes you get a few months. But again, that's still pretty short in the scheme of all game design. But if you execute on your ideas early and plan it out and do a great job of documenting it so everybody can know what they want to work towards, it makes a lot of difference. And it can add a huge impact and really increase how the players buy into those games, especially smaller games. Because you'll never be able to iron out all of the problems that you want in that short period of time. A good story that pulls the players in can help them forgive certain things and make the gameplay still enjoyable, even if it's flawed. These are all games that I personally worked on in the game minor. One of them was a story that I pitched, and my team loved it, and we ran with it, and it was a heavily flawed game, because we made it in a month. But it was still solid in what we wanted to deliver on it, even if the mechanics were very flawed. Another game was a team that was on didn't want to make a story-driven game. They wanted to make just a beat 'em up. And I did the best that I could with the parts that I had to make sure that there was some kind of narrative, some kind of connective tissue for the whole game, so that way it felt like there was something there. And the last one is a team that I got put on where they already had a story. They already were developing the game. And what I'm doing is just to do my part to make sure that the story is well-rounded and well-received once the game's finally finished. But doing this, making games, you guys are all just telling stories. No matter how simple or how sidelined the narrative gives, you are storytellers. Whether you are narrative designers or programmers or artists or gameplay designers, you tell stories. So with that, go tell some good stories. And thank you for letting me do this. That's all I got, unless people have questions.
Questions, comments, concerns, jokes? Yes.
Do you ever feel like a story gets in the way of a game, whether it be because the story is poorly written or maybe the game doesn't necessarily benefit from the presence that it has? And if so, how do you sort of track that?
I do think that sometimes story gets in the way of games. I think story gets in the way of games when it affects the feel of the entire game. Certain things like long drawn-out cutscenes or dialogue that you have to click through when the gameplay is more fast-paced, things that detract from the overall experience, whether it's story, programming, mechanics, whatever. If it feels like it just slows the game down when it's supposed to be fast, speeds it up when it's supposed to be slow, or pulls away from what the main experience is supposed to be, yeah. And the best way to get around that is to look at the experience that you're designing. If it's supposed to be a fast-paced game and you want to introduce narrative elements, maybe don't do it where the players have to stop and watch a cutscene. Maybe you just run by a character that spouts a little bit of dialogue, and if players want to stop and see what they're saying for a moment, they can do that.
The best way to show this is in Doom, where you have a moment where everyone keeps spouting dialogue at you, and you can either sort of sit there, but the main character himself is like, no, and just kind of throws it aside and continues on.
Yeah, the first big soliloquy that is delivered, he just punches the screen before the guy's halfway done. And then you have games like Dark Souls, where it's very much about the fighting and the punch-ups, and all of the story is delivered through item descriptions, and it's up to you to kind of piece it together. In those kinds of games, the story, while it may be important, and it may connect everything together, if you find enjoyment without paying attention to the story, you can still find enjoyment in that game. Any other questions or anything? Yeah.
What's your definition, like a story-driven game? I'm thinking like Life is Strange, how I don't want to say you just walk around and talk to people.
Well, yeah, but that is the main
yeah,
function.
there's no, I don't know, I guess there's no difficulty sort of, which makes it sort of a niche sort of thing, I guess. Is that what you mean by story-driven game? Or do you mean a game with just a deep and interesting story?
When I talk about a story-driven game, I mean a game that is driven by a narrative, that has an ideal beginning, middle, and end. Life is Strange is a game about choices. So the whole game is about talking to people, learning about it, and making choices when there's no clear right or wrong. But I'm also a huge fan of the Halo series and all the expanded lore that comes with it. In my opinion, even games like Halo 3, which I played through dozens of times, or ODST, which was up on there as one of my favorites, have a very clear story, and they are driven by their own stories. In ODST, you're just trying to look for your squad and escape the city, and you have to piece together the story kind of out of order. But that game's still driven by its story, because it still has a main character that is going through a narrative and is achieving its goals. It might be different from how most people would define it, as many story-driven games are visual novels or walking simulators. But any game that can follow a clear narrative, in my opinion, is a story-driven game.
Do you prefer getting a story for a game and then matching a game to it, or getting a game and then making a story for that game?
I prefer doing it at the same time. I understand what you're saying, but when you try and put things together, that's where you can develop sequences that don't make sense. You can have a game that is maybe something supposed to be like Sonic, very fast-paced and very adrenaline high. But if you match it with a deep Shakespearean narrative, it can work. There are ways to make it work. But if the story slows down the game, it doesn't make sense. And if you start with a story that is, I don't want to say overdeveloped, but is very developed, something that may fit more for a novel or for a movie where there is no variation. Because in a game, you always have to think about what the player is going to do. It's their experience and they experience it firsthand, so it needs to make sense for what choices they make. Whether or not it's a game that's based around choices or not, they will decide to do things. You put a button in front of a player, they will usually press it, but there are some that won't. So if you build it alongside each other, if you come up with a story, just like a seed, the idea of like, okay, I want to tell a story about trains, and then develop the mechanics of how the player could experience it alongside it, that usually works the best. The example that I had on there was the game Paper Planes. That was a concept that I came up with, and that is a game about that is a game that's supposed to be about self-care. That would be a turn-based game where you have to try and fix things, and if you run out of energy, you start to suffer the effects of not caring for yourself, and then you start to get worse and worse and worse things you do. And sometimes you have to take a turn and not do anything. So yes, you can develop standard sets of mechanics around a specific narrative, but it helps to make sure you have a bit of both. I knew that game was going to be that it was going to have the story of self-care and the idea of turn-based mechanics before I got very deep into what both of those meant. Yeah.
Do you think Super Paper Mario has too much story?
I have not played Super Paper Mario. I've seen and heard about it. And I think, like I said earlier, I think narrative only becomes a problem when it detracts from the overall experience. And I have played that game a little bit. I definitely didn't finish it. And from what I remember, it seemed okay. Without finishing it, I can't tell you exactly.
Like, in the previous Paper Marios, like that was the original,
Yeah.
the gameplay was like a little slower, like as you go into battle and then you fight and then you leave. But in Super Paper Mario, you just kind of jump on things and you'll die. And so the story in that game is sort of like how you were saying, like with Sonic being fast, and then if it's just about talking, like I have a lot of friends that played it but never finished it because of the story just being like it's good, but it's a lot. And since the gameplay is quick, you feel like you're talking more than playing.
So what I remember the most from that game is there was a sequence where you went into a mansion and you got into debt, and you had to work it off, and you had to explore the mansion to basically work off the different points. That part sticks out to me because it connects so well with the story. The mechanics of the game don't change, but you're given a reason why you have to stay in one place and accomplish so many goals. I can see how if the game spreads out and is more like the general Super Mario games where you just have levels and worlds that you clear, how a heavy story could slow that game down. So I can see it being possible. Best I can say. Yeah.
I was wondering how much focus you put on like the main character as a player, because I feel like a lot of games I played recently, especially some more like open world games, you're in this super like story enriched world with all these cool characters, but you yourself, you're just like a taskmaster. They have to tell you what to do when you go and you just do it. And I feel like that like doesn't lend well to the game overall. So how much emphasis do you put on like the main character as the player?
So, yeah, sure.
Because I actually know why. there's a reason that for a large amount of games that you play where it's like they have this large open world and you just go through and you don't do anything or like you just sort of a side pass, it's because the number one reason for a person to like get involved with a game is to have the character be the blank slate that you're allowed to fill yourself in for. You don't really get answers or personality in those games because you're supposed to fill it in yourself. It's like Skyrim. You walk into a building and you see someone getting mugged and then they offer you money to help along. You can just kill them or you can help them along. It's up to you, and it gives you that wiggle room of like, they don't define you, you define that character.
As opposed to then stuff like, I'll say like the other example of like Nathan Drake in Uncharted. You are the hero good guy who's gonna go do, you know, X, Y, and Z in order to save the world.
That being said, there are characters that do ride the line. Characters like the Doom guy in the most recent Doom games that while he doesn't speak, he definitely has a personality about him. He doesn't care about the story. He's here to fight demons. And that can imprint on the player as much as they can imprint on the character. Or characters like Master Chief, who, well, yes, he does have dialogue and he has his own story that he's on. He is a faceless protagonist that when you pick up the controller, you are in the armor, you wield the weapons, you are the Master Chief. So, while there can be characters that are complete blank slates or characters that have all the personality traits in the world, there also can be a little bit of middle room. Yeah.
What's your least favorite game as far as narrative design? What's the one that just irks you the most, that you wish you could straight up delete and like nobody would even know it ever existed?
Destiny, but not for the reason of deleting it. There was a theory about Destiny right around the time it earlier about where the story was going to go, and it was really interesting.
Yeah.
And the game also, just before its launch, was pitched as a game that was going to be in development for 10 years. All they were going to do was just expand on the one. So when Destiny 2 came out, it was a big disappointment for me. Playing through the original Destiny and just how little story content there was a big disappointment. And the original theories that Bungie later said they had considered, not that people they were going to use fan theories, but the fans were on about where they wanted to go with the story, was interesting. There was betrayal, lies, there was questioning your own morals and your decisions in this world and how that was going to go. And growing that with a big online game could have been very interesting, with players making different choices and ending up in different places. But they chose not to go that route. They chose to make you the hero no matter what you did. And that's fine. That works for some games. But personally, I would have loved to go back and go with the riskier, more interesting story.
Okay, I kind of want to like re-ask the question, but so if that's the one you're most disappointed in, which one do you think was just objectively worse, like the worst written? Like not the one with the most missed potential.
Yeah.
Complete trash.
Skittles.
Yeah.
I honestly, I enjoy playing bad games for the mechanics, for the story, and I can't think of one right now that I would just say full stop, get rid of.
Okay, what's your favorite bad game then?
Oh, man.
If you say Skittles, the spirit of Brock will run through the door.
I'm tempted to do that, or say something about the Kool-Aid Man, but I won't. There's a game that I'm playing right now called Live Lock that is a very interesting story, but again, it doesn't seem to mesh with its gameplay too well. It's a top-down twin-stick shooter that has a weird emphasis on precision in the weapons, and the story, I may not have gotten through enough of it yet to fully understand it, but it feels like one of those situations where it doesn't completely line up. It's a level-based game when it feels like I should just be able to go, and the levels feel like they're there for the furtherment of the narrative. But I want to just keep going. Like, I want to just go into this next zone and see what's next. I don't want to have to stop and go level up my dude. I want to just keep on trucking.
Well, push the button. That's what I want to do.
Yeah.
How do you think you can fix the narrative design flaws of like MMO games that like they all fall into the same category of everyone's the hero, then they know it is?
Well, I don't think there is any fixing it. Again, every narrative design for every game is different because there's different players, there's different demographics, there's different wants out of what they want out of the player. They want everybody to feel like the hero. They want everybody to feel like they have an impact on the world. I think some MMOs do it better than others. My personal favorite was WildStar before it was shut down, because the game was about exploring a world that nobody had ever seen before. So even though technically people had gotten to different parts of it, like you can imagine the thousands of people playing it have obviously seen everything, getting to a new area, the story and the interactions always made you feel like you were the first one to plant your flag and be there. So it did a good job of letting you feel victorious, even though in the back of your head you knew somewhere, oh yeah, Steve XX9000 was here 5 minutes ago, but now I'm doing it. I'm the first one ever to have accomplished this. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on games that have the story just completely separate from the game? Like where there is a story, but it has nothing to do with the game. I mean, Overwatch is a good example.
Overwatch?
Overwatch has a story in theory.
Overwatch confuses me. It's one of those instances where it was definitely a game, but the point is not the narrative. The point of the game is not the story. But story can pull in players. Story can make people invested. There are people that have favorite characters in Overwatch, not because they're good, but because they are like, I know this person's story. This person feels relatable to me. This person is somebody that I would aspire to be. So the heavy emphasis on character design and then using out-of-game story is their best way of doing it. It confuses me from the aspect of I don't know if I was given that job how I would sit down and do it. No idea. But they definitely found a way to do it that's best for them.
Neither do they.
Yeah.
Do you feel like when people upload cutscenes to the internet that it ruins the game?
It doesn't ruin the game, but does leave things out. If you want a very good example of this, there is a YouTube channel called Retroplay, where Nolan North and Troy Baker sit down and play video games. And recently they started working through the Uncharted series, where Nolan North is Nathan Drake. And he's never played through the games before. So it's a very interesting take on these guys who've worked on games, and specifically the games that they're playing, taking a look at it. And one of the things that
again?
it's called Retroplay.
Retro.
Retro Refund, sorry.
The idea that Nolan North doesn't play the games that he's in, but at the same time he's in everything, so I'm
So
really
that's why I
He
need
plays
to.
nothing.
I love the Uncharted games. I need to watch and play them.
But the point being, one of the ones they talk about is when you go back and watch the cutscenes, they are just the cutscenes. But there are dozens and dozens and dozens of lines recorded and interactions with characters that happen either in the action moments or just outside that nobody ever uploads because they're not the cutscenes. And you miss out on that. You miss out on the characters interacting. And in those games, the characters are the most important thing in the way they interact with each other. And specific lines that were either off the cuff or that people came up with in thousands of takes that they were doing. Or even well-written lines that are just hilarious and fantastic interactions. You miss that. You get the greater story overall, and it's fantastic for people like me that can't afford to buy every game. I've watched plenty of those things to get the idea of stories when I want to research a game. But you do miss somewhere. Anyone else?
What are your? I know you were talking about Dark Souls earlier, and I've seen a lot of people. I've been playing the Dark Souls. I've seen a lot of people draw similarities between Dark Souls and Hollow Knight, games that do not explicitly tell you a story. They just kind of let you explore the environment and read items and signs and stuff, and that's what tells you the story. What are your opinion on games like those?
I think they're fine. I definitely don't think Dark Souls was the first one ever to do it, but there was a lot of phenomenon about the first Dark Souls and how it came out that it coined the term before even other developers started ripping it off of a Souls-like game. So the idea that the world is simply happening and that you have to go and find the story and find whatever's happening, I think that's a fantastic way to tell a story. The thing is, it has to be paired with something else interesting. If the story is not what's pulling the players in, if that's not what's initially grabbing them, then it's got to have fantastic gameplay or art or something else that gets the players wanting to know more. I see a lot of people fault Dark Souls for having all of its lore behind items, for very little character interaction that makes it hard to understand what's going on. Where Hollow Knight does a bit of a better job, I guess you could say, where you get some of the story from interacting with NPCs. But the point of those games is that the story is there for the players to find. And that the game that they are selling is a difficult skill-based game. Dark Souls being 3D, Hollow Knight being 2D.
Can I talk about Dark Souls for a second?
Sure.
As someone who has about 1,000 hours in
Oh my
the game.
Go for it.
The cool thing about Dark Souls, and I remember hearing this from someone I was watching play through Dark Souls 3, is Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 and Bloodborne all have this idea of cool things happened, but you just missed it. like literally, like if you had been like a day or two quicker, or like a month or a year quicker, you would have seen the cool thing, and you missed it. So you're going through these worlds that all have these interesting things, and there's all this cool shit, and there's all this dead shit because you missed the cool, super cool thing. Like the world is dying, you missed the world at its peak. Like you missed it.
You're just the cleanup guy.
You're like 2 seconds too late all the time.
It's actually very similar to the overall lore in Lord of the Rings, that the gods have left, and now the elves are leaving, and slowly magic and wonder is leaving the world. Dark Souls and Hollow Knight and those kind of games are very much games of entropy, where all of the magic and all of the wonder is going. And you have to do whatever you can to keep the world limping along for reasons that you make up on your own. They don't give you a clear reason why you do this. So hand it back there. That's right. Anybody else? Yeah.
In any kind of game with an expansive story that keeps growing on itself, especially with things like MMOs like WoW or Destiny, what is your view of usage of retcons? When is it healthy to use a retcon as opposed to using them purely to kind of like...
I would go to the examples that Marvel's done when they've had to do recasting, where it's important to address that it's happened and to keep going. You're never going to be able to please every kind of person that plays your game, and especially not in MMOs when there are thousands and thousands of people that play the game daily. People will draw their own conclusions about where characters should go, where the story should go, who should be with whom, what's happening, and you have to do your best to create something that pleases the audience as a whole. And when it comes time to change something, whether it's actors getting changed, stories getting rewritten, I think the best way to do it is just to do it and not step around and be very cautious about doing it. And then once it's done, address it and move forward. Similar to how loot boxes in games should never let you buy power, a retcon should never take anything away from the players. It shouldn't take power away from the players just because this story beat has to be gotten rid of. It should move it away, move forward, and just reference that it's gone. Own it and move forward.
There is also an issue that for specific content and things, sometimes the main person who wrote that original thing is just not there anymore. Like they're just gone. So whatever they did may not make sense anymore, or they might never have planned for where they wanted to go. So you kind of have to make changes, you have to make tweaks, you have to make adjustments in ways that you probably never saw coming, but you kind of have to do now because you put yourself in a corner.
But that's also why it's important for any of you as a narrative designer working on expansive projects to document everything the best way possible. This game may exist for 20 years, you may be a part of it for 2. But if you're in charge or part of making the story, and you can leave a clear path of, here's where we're started, that's where we want it to be, here's an idea of how we got there, it makes that transition easier. It makes it harder when things are kept secret and people don't share the information, which has come up in the industry before, not specifically narrative design. It's a competitive industry and sometimes people choose to further themselves before the team. It happens and there's no right or wrong to it. But making that clear documentation can make it easier for when you have to pass the torch and somebody else can pick it up. It may not be exactly what you had in mind, but it might help make it more fluid. Anything else? All right, that's it.
Round of applause. Nice talk to you.
Great, good talk. Oh, the longest Q&A session we've ever had in our life. That's amazing.
It's your team.
Okay, you want to do that?
Yeah, let's do that. Ready? 1, 2, 3. You're free.
Stay warm, everyone.
I'm talking about
I can't tell. That's fair.